Welcome to this reflections video for paper 1 for the Edexcel history exams of 2025. This time we'll be looking at medicine, crime and punishment and the warfare topics. If you've done migration, I'm really sorry, but I just cannot find the questions for there and I don't know the course well enough, so I didn't do any predictions for that one this year. As soon as more centres take it up, I'll probably change my mind on that. First of all, a little bit of a plug. Have I helped you? If so, please help me to help others. I'm a full-time history teacher and head of department, so I haven't got all that much time on my hands. Originally, these videos were just made for my students, but now I know, brilliantly, they help thousands of others too. This year, I've added crime and punishment and Cold War rapid revision playlists on top of my day job and workload. So if you want to thank me for my work, please do subscribe, like the videos and comment. It all helps the YouTube algorithm, and at this time that's particularly important. As you can imagine, my subscriptions and views go off an absolute cliff at the end of the exams, and it makes YouTube think that I've done something dreadful to upset everyone. We know that's not the case, it's just the manner of things. So if you really want to thank me, after your exams, just stay subscribed, I'll be tremendously grateful. Alright, now I've knocked that on the head, let's look at medicine through time. This was the exam paper for medicine through time for this year, 2025. Section A. A. Describe one feature of fighting on the Western Front that led to a high number of injuries. I mean, you could pretty much talk about anything there and get the marks. And then B, describe one feature of the use of blood transfusions on the Western Front. That's come up in previous years, so it's interesting that they've had it again. But these are only worth 2 marks each, so hopefully you found them pretty straightforward. Then, question 2A. How useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the difficulties of caring for the wounded on the Western Front? The biggest criticism I've got of these sources is frankly they're just a little bit boring, but I think the question itself was not too difficult. You could have talked about lots of different things when it comes to difficulties in caring for the wounded, and lots of those conditions are mentioned. Things like the winter and the sheer number of casualties during the Battle of the Somme. And then question 2B was how could you follow up source A for the very same inquiry? Section B. Question 3. Explain one way in which the Great Plague in London 1665 was similar to the cholera epidemic in London in 1854. This is a pretty unexpected question in a way, and it's a pretty strange one, but actually when you think about it, they do fit pretty well. I would suggest that if you're mentioning miasma for this sort of question, that would be a good one to go with. Explain why Pasteur's germ theory 1861 led to changes in medicine in the years 1861 to the present. Stimulus points given were Koch's work in identifying microbes and antiseptic surgery. Frankly, this is an absolute gift of a question. There's so much you could write about it. I think the biggest risk here is that you just try and write down everything and run out of time. I thought it was a really nice question. Question 5. In the years 1250 to 1700, medicine was mainly based on the theory of the 4 humours, circa 1500 to 1700. How far do you agree? Galen, herbs and spices. 16 marks for this one here. Yep, I think this would be a pretty popular question, this one here. And actually, I think that most people will have done this. And then in the years 1800 to the present, the role of the government was the most important factor in improving care and treatment in hospitals. How far do you agree? The creation of the NHS in 1948 and Nightingale's notes on nursing being the stimulus points. This one here I think is a pretty reasonable question as well, but I just don't think it will have been as popular as question 5. Speaking to my pupils, that seems to have been the case. If you think differently, by all means let us know in the comments. So let's see how accurate the predictions were. These were the things I identified as repeated inclusions. Medieval treatment and prevention was very relevant in question 5, but also medieval doctors came up in the question as well, so that would have been relevant. Vesalius didn't come up, nor did Harvey, nor did Sydenham. Industrial surgery, though, was a stimulus point for question 4 when it's talking about antiseptics. So that is a good prediction too. Modern causes of illness didn't come up, but then public health reformers would have been relevant to question 3. So not bad so far. In terms of things that had never appeared, well, did any of them this year? The key battles, which I thought might just be context, would have actually been relevant to question 1A. So that might have been something that you included. With section B, well, there was some relevance there as well. Magic bullets would have been relevant to question 4. So not so much here, but actually things that could have been quite helpful too. In terms of topics that have rarely appeared, well, this is what I thought of. Treatment of injuries might have been relevant to question 1B and question 2, possibly, but definitely trench warfare and trench systems, which I thought might just be context, would have been really useful for question 1A. So if you revise that, you'd probably be pretty happy. Also, the Royal Army Medical Corps, First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, Nursing Services, etc. would have definitely been relevant to question 2A and 2B, so again, was probably well worth looking at that if you did. Then in section B, Medieval and Renaissance causes of illness. This was relevant to question 3 and to question 5. Other than that, not a lot. So these other things, they may well come up next year. The final summary for medicine then. Predictions about World War I fighting and nursing services were at least relevant quite directly for question 1A. Predictions related to magic bullets and antiseptics were very relevant to question 4 and others. A more varied paper than 2024 and no repeat of 2023's error, so that's good news. Paper fairly balanced across time periods with perhaps something of a modern focus at times depending on your choice for questions 5 and 6, but I expect that most people will have done question 5. Pupils largely positive about the exam and confident in their reactions. That seems to be what I've been hearing in the comments, but also from my own pupils. Be mindful though of higher grade boundaries if the stats show that the paper was considered easy, though it seems similar to last year, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. I would expect it to be fairly similar. Fair paper overall, good opportunities to draw on broad knowledge, and I think people are very happy with it. Let's move on to crime and punishment, this year's exam. Section A, question 1A, was describe one feature of the provision of accommodation for the poor in Whitechapel, and describe one feature for question 1B on the problems that police had when investigating Jack the Ripper. Question 2A was how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the lives of people living in Whitechapel. I'll be honest, I've not seen the sources for this, so I can't be absolutely sure which bits of knowledge would have been relevant, but I can probably make a reasonable guess. And then section B, explain one way in which the attitude of the government to the use of the death penalty in the 18th century and 19th centuries, circa 1700 to 1900, was different from the attitude of the government to the use of the death penalty in the modern period, circa 1900 to the present. That's a pretty good question, that one there. Not worth very many marks though. Then question 4, explain why there was an increase in crime in the years 1500 to 1700. Your stimulus points were vagabondage and treason. You might have mentioned witchcraft for this as well. Question 5 was trial by ordeal was the most important feature of the church's influence on crime and punishment during the medieval period, circa 1250 to 1700. How far do you agree? Stimulus points given were trial by hot iron and benefit of clergy. And then question 6, the introduction of the separate system was the most significant development in the use of prisons in the years circa 1800 to the present. Now the stimulus points for that one were Pentonville Prison and young offenders. Very, very different questions, so hopefully at least one of those would have suited you. What about the predictions then? Here are my repeated inclusions. The first thing that seemed to come up was medieval deterrence and retribution, which was likely relevant in question 5. Also, Renaissance crimes very much came up for question 4. I understand that yes, this is often called the early modern period, but I'm really referring to the period circa 1500 to 1700 here. Prison reforms also would have come up, as did young offenders. This was actually a stimulus point with question 6, so if you revise these things, that would have been pretty popular as well. Then the Whitechapel topics, we did have lodging houses, which would have been very relevant to question 1A. Only worth 2 marks, but if you'd revised lodging houses, you'd have been able to write about them. I'd be amazed if you didn't get both of those marks. What about things that have never appeared? Well, in section A, the Peabody estate would have been very relevant to question 1A as well, and policing an H division would have been very relevant to question 1B. The national versus regional factors didn't come up though. In section B, the gunpowder plot of 1605 would have been very relevant to question 4 if you wanted to write about it as an example of treason. In terms of other things, the Derek Bentley case and the abolition of the death penalty, which was actually a really popular video in the playlist, was very relevant for question 3, so hopefully you've revised that. In terms of topics that have rarely appeared, well, the environment in Whitechapel may well have been relevant to question 2A and 2B, but without seeing the sources, I can't be absolutely sure there. If you think that it was relevant, pop it in the comments, but equally, if I'm wrong on that, do let me know as well. In terms of other things that came up, well, not as much as previously, but Pentonville Prison turned out to be a stimulus point for question 6, so that would have been really helpful. The abolition of the death penalty, which we've already mentioned, but previously in relation to the Derek Bentley case, that came up for question 3. So actually, we did all right there, I think. So that was pretty good predictions all round. Let's go on to a final summary. I think possibly this paper was my strongest one in terms of predictions, so hopefully that was helpful for you. Lots of predictions were either relevant or actually mentioned this year, including stuff about prisons, early modern and Renaissance crimes, abolition of the death penalty, accommodation in Whitechapel, all of those things appeared. It was a fairly varied paper, with medieval, early modern and Renaissance, modern periods, all of them covered. Fairly balanced across the time periods too, allowing opportunities to demonstrate broad knowledge. However, there was something of a modern focus, including punishments 1800 to the present in section B, if candidates did question 6. Pupils were largely positive about the exam, according to the comments that I've seen. but be mindful again of higher grade boundaries if the stats show that the paper was so-called easy. Though it seems similar to last year, I wouldn't be too worried. Fair paper overall, good opportunities to draw on broad knowledge again. I think this was a pretty good one. Hopefully you agree. On to warfare. This is the paper that fewer people do, and as such I've actually not seen a physical copy of the paper. However, I've been told what the questions were, and there's only one that I got a few doubts over. Please, if I do get it wrong, pop it in the comments and I'll make sure that I share that and make sure everyone knows. But let's see what I think was in the paper. So, question 1A, describe one feature of the process of evacuation from London and describe one feature of the Cabinet war rooms. It's possible that those questions were actually in the opposite order. I've heard both. And then question 2A, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the impact of bombing during the first Blitz? Now, I believe that source A here was a picture of the Balham tube disaster with the bus falling into the hole in the ground where the tube station collapsed underneath. I believe that's right. And the other is an eyewitness account of the bombing. And it was source A, the picture of the bus falling into Balham tube station, that was used for questions 2A and 2B. For section B then, explain one way in which civilians suffered in the period 1250 to 1500 was similar to the way civilians suffered in the period 1500 to 1700. Then question 4, explain why the role of cavalry on the battlefield changed in the period circa 1250 to 1700. Stimulus points given were Oliver Cromwell and mounted knights. Then question 5, this is the one I've got the biggest question marks over. Industrialisation was the biggest factor for change in warfare in the period circa 1700 to 1900. I have been told by someone else though that it was about heavy artillery in the composition of armies. I think though that was actually a question from last year's exam paper, so it might have been someone misremembering this. If you could let me know in the comments, I'd be very, very grateful. So with this one here, the stimulus points were Cardwell's reforms and mass production, as far as I've been told. Then question 6. The introduction of conscription was the biggest development in recruitment circa 1700 to the present. How far do you agree? The stimulus points given were conscription in World War I and, well, this looks like a typo, but it isn't, Cardwell's reforms again. That's the first time I've ever seen the same stimulus point come up twice in the same section of an exam. And in fact, I think it's the first time I've seen the same stimulus points come up twice at all in any exam. So that's a bit of a weird thing with this one, but I don't think it necessarily makes it a bad paper. So these are the repeated inclusions. The exam paper seems to absolutely love mounted knights, and again that's come up as a stimulus point in question 4. Other than that though, there were a few other things that have come up yet again. Naseby 1645, that's one of the favourite battles it seems, and that would have been very relevant to the Cromwell stimulus point for question 4 as well. Industrial era tech and changes was relevant to question 5, very relevant I believe, but again if you could confirm what question 5 actually was, then we'd know whether that was a good prediction or somewhat wide of the mark. Other than that, there's not a lot else to mention. So let's move on to the next section. In terms of the topics that have never appeared, well, most of them have still never appeared unless I've got something wrong. However, there was something. Recruitment in the industrial era was very, very relevant to question 6. So that's good news if you revise that. In terms of things that have only rarely appeared, well, we had a little bit more here to go on. So medieval effects on civilians was a big part of question 3, and the other half of that was Renaissance or early modern effects on civilians, which was the other side of that too. So hopefully you revised that based upon this recommendation. Otherwise, that's about it. The warfare one, which might make sense because fewer people do it, it's harder to predict, there's less data available based upon it, was probably my weakest set of predictions. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't anything. So what do I think of the warfare paper overall, having looked at it? Some predictions were either relevant or actually mentioned this year, for example with recruitment, effects on civilians, cavalry and a few other things. It was a fairly varied paper with medieval, early modern and Renaissance, modern periods all covered. Fairly balanced across the time periods, allowing for opportunities to demonstrate broad knowledge, except for the 16 mark questions. This was a similar time period focus for both question 5 and question 6, which is odd enough in itself. But what's really weird is that Caldwell's reforms were mentioned twice as stimulus points. I've never seen that, but again, I don't think it necessarily would have held someone back. It does seem like a bit of a shame that there was such a similar time period for both question 5 and question 6. I don't think it offered you as much choice there. So if you're weak on the modern period, which hopefully you weren't, you probably struggled with those questions. However, the reactions that I've got from the few pupils I've heard from on this one here suggest that they were pretty positive about the exam. But again, the same warnings apply about higher grade boundaries. It's nothing that you can control, but it should be fair. I don't think necessarily this would be considered as easy a paper as the other ones, but it's just something to be mindful of. I'd expect pretty similar grade boundaries this year compared to last, which is a good thing, makes all of our jobs easier. It was a fair paper overall, good opportunities to draw on broad knowledge, like I say, with the possible exception of the 16 markers. Let's close out with our final points. Paper 1 is done. However it went, just move on. Get on with paper 2 and paper 3 now. Don't dwell on it. If it went really well, give yourself a pat on the back, then get on with the hard work of sorting out the next exams. If it didn't go so well, don't give yourself a hard time. What is done is done. Just move on to the next papers and maximise your chances there. Remember, I've got playlists for the American Wests and Superpower Relations Wider World Period Studies, and I've also got playlists on the Anglo-Saxons and Normans and early Elizabethan England British Depth Studies. Check out my predictions video for paper 2 topics as well, and paper 3. Don't forget you need to revise for paper 3 alongside paper 2. It's less than a week after paper 2, so if you leave it to the last minute, you'll probably do less well. So try and do a little bit of both. I've got playlists for both the USA conflict at home and abroad and Germany topics as well. The next exams are paper 2 on Thursday, June the 5th. That's in the morning, and paper 3 on Tuesday the 10th of June, and that's in the afternoon, at which point your GCSEs will be done and dusted. So just one final reminder to like the video, comment beneath if you can give me some advice, and also subscribe to the channel if you want to thank me for my work. Now I'm recording this on my day off on a Saturday. It's beautiful sunshine outside, and quite frankly, I'm going to go off to a gig now. I hope that you're doing something nice as well, and the very best of luck for the next papers. Goodbye, thanks for watching, see ya.